So interestingly enough, I was one of those people that made brownies that turned you blue and put you into a tree or whatever you said. I find the more interesting thing about the products I made in the cannabis space before, or what I did with food in the cannabis space versus what I'm doing now, is an edible or an infused product used to be something that I made incredibly strong for that purpose, that I was giving it to people that were regular consumers of cannabis, and the edible used to be something that had the connotation that it has today because that was the intent.
Cake.
We wanted to mess people up, and it was how to take pot from an
now we've converted that edible into medicine.
Yes.
We will only have a 10 milligram serving size.
Even though probably some of the people that could benefit the most from THC as a medicine, the very sick, cancer patients and things like that, would need a much, much higher dose than we have available.
They can have up to 1,000 milligrams if they don't separate the recreational and the medical licenses.
They've
all included it to one now.
Yes.
So you just have to eat more calories.
You have to ingest a lot more calories or take a lot more pills.
And spend more money.
And spend more money. Which is something that I think is a major loss as far as us leaving 215 as we move towards recreational. So the interest, the intent. I was a cannabis cultivator in San Francisco. I paid my bills when I was a $10 an hour cook in grow rooms and in hash factories, and I would do things that paid me, what I would make in a week in a few hours, and I was able to exist in that very, very expensive city.
Now that's a cultivator. What's a gangier?
So a gangier we are styling as a expert in cannabis as it pertains to flavor. And one of the more interesting things about how cannabis and the flavor of cannabis interact is that the effect of the cannabinoids in relationship to the chemicals that are responsible for their taste, flavor, aroma are terpenes. That relationship, the correlation between the ratio between those two sets of active chemicals in your brain and body are what are responsible for how and why pot gets you stoned the way it does.
Okay. Terpenes is another term that's tossed around so much among those in the industry, and for those outside the industry, it's like what?
It's a much more surprising
thing. Is that stuff
thing.
you use to clean paint or
It
brushes?
could be. 60% of all organic matter is actually classified as a
That's
terpene.
terpenes high.
I thought you were talking about pinene, which is a pine sol. And alpha pinene is so think of terpenes as a class of ever and constantly evaporating molecules, which are in an extremely high prevalence in anything and everything all around you as long as it has an organic source. So things from metal to dirt to the paint, anything in the entire organic world has and is comprised of terpenes. So,
but most interestingly, in food.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
every single bar and restaurant in the world
is cooking with
terpenes,
using
and they don't
terpenes,
even know
pouring
it.
terpenes.
So terpenes are in lemons, they're in rosemary, they're in mangoes, they're in mushrooms, they're in various degrees and various percentages and ratios in a variety of herbs. Anything that's going to kind of give you that resinous, oily feeling when you touch it with your hands. If you go and rub a rosemary plant and you're going to smell that on your fingers afterward, that's the terpenes. So that's something that is already so ingrained in our culinary cultural lexicon, and being able to connect that with cannabis is really what a gangier does. Think of it like a sommelier. Think of it as somebody who's going to be pairing something with a food or with an experience to create an immersive dining and cultural opportunity. So that's what we focus on at Altered Plates, and that's actually because Holden is a cultivator and is constantly growing and has access to the plant in all of these various stages. We can play with terpenes in a variety of ways, and Holden will sometimes pair a specific variety with a dish and tell you, okay, first you're going to taste the cannabis, and we'll walk people through a little 3-step tasting method that we've developed in order to do that, and then you'll take a bite of the food, or sometimes he'll say take a bite of the food and then taste the cannabis. So it really is about understanding the flavors on the palate and how they compare and contrast.
Well, but it sounds like terpene is just something that's everywhere.
They are.
Okay.
They're in everything.
Okay.
But that's the thing. People don't know that, and people are very surprised. So yes, terpenes are the aromatic molecules that are responsible for the flavor and effect. That is something entirely separate that we definitely should discuss, because the effect that you're going to get from a specific variety is not just about its THC percentage or its CBD percentage or the ratio between. The terpenes are what are really going to give you that effect, and essentially that's aromatherapy.
But we also have to deal with the flavor, because we had a cultivator on a few weeks ago on High on the Hog, the podcast, who spoke about how just straight CBD, a bucket full of CBD, it tastes just awful. Just awful. You couldn't eat it. So you've got to transform it into something that's actually palatable. So you can't just have a jar of CBD and you pour a little bit in your soup or something. I mean, you've got to make this a usable ingredient. Do you look at THC, CBD, etc., at cannabis products when cooking as a spice, an herb, something like salt, something like pepper? I know you have cannasseur. You have something that even connects with.
I think you start first with the terpenes as to what effect it is. So say you have stomach ailments, you're going to naturally be drawn to, or someone's going to educate you to tell you that a tangerine or something like that is going to help that. Then you have something that's limonene, thank you. And something like that's going to help your muscle tension in the back of your neck and like headaches. And those specific terpenes come from specific strains. And whether they're grown outdoor or indoor, you're still going to have those profiles.
But how did you start using it? I mean, did you start putting it in spaghetti sauce?
So I would
oregano?
Say, for an infusion purpose, what you're after is obviously the cannabinoids. And then, like you just said, cannabinoids are not very tasty. So in infusion, a lot of those terpenes, they're going to either be changed through the process. They're not going to be what they were. But when you do combust them and when you smoke them, you are able to create sort of a standardized, idealized effect of what that variety is. So have you ever seen an analysis of a chemical breakdown of a terpene? Like if you have a tested product in a recreational dispensary today, it should have the cannabinoids, pesticides, all those things that they test for, and in addition to it can also represent the terpenes. And with that, you'll see this long list of all these chemicals with deltas and alphas and all these symbols that you wouldn't possibly understand if you weren't schooled in it. But if you were to look at rosemary and do that exact same chemical analysis, you will see that same list, this multifaceted full spectrum of all of these phytochemicals or plant-based chemicals. So these chemicals are essentially the map to why the cannabis tastes, smells, and
Effects.
later, when ingested with cannabinoids, affects you the way it does. On their own, terpenes can have why do we put lavender in a room when we're trying to fall asleep? Like these are these touchstones that we have out of aromatherapy that Rachel mentioned. One of the most interesting things I would say is when I started looking at this a few years ago, all the evidence I could find was said, it basically ended with, but that's aromatherapy and it's a pseudoscience. Literally, like good, hard scientific evidence. The interest in terpenes as they relate to cannabis has made central a few things. One of those things is how food makes us feel, which I think as a chef is one of the most interesting conversations that has started. Now that we're starting to know what's responsible for why food tastes the way it does and why those chemicals are there, we are going to eventually find out why you crave a certain meal when you do. I feel like the question, what do you feel like eating, has been made very, very important to me as a chef that's dealing with experience. I'm not just feeding my guests, I'm leading them down a path. And I'm able to transition the flavor from each dish and using these guides of terpenes as a flavor touchstone, I'm also able to manipulate the guest's experience of what they're going through and how they are experiencing this menu I put forward. Each dish has thought behind it, and to think that I could direct table conversation on top of that, I think that's it's pretty beautiful. Obviously, in wine, you've been to many tastings. You've been guided through that process and what it does, but nobody ends it with like, okay, so that Merlot should get you feeling this way, and now I'm going to lead you into this, and that conversation adds a layer to experiential hospitality, which doesn't exist right now. And in my pursuit of doing these events, I have found a way to do more than just guide them through what it tastes like.
So we have to go back. Where did this begin?
So I was the pastry chef at Soho House in West Hollywood.
Right.
And I think like any good cook or chef, I'd reached that point in my 12 to 14 years on a kitchen where I just needed a break. Either way, I got 2 kids, and it was a great way for me to step back and reassess. And I mean, it sort of just started happening, and it seemed like it was what I was meant to do, because while I was a sous chef, while I was working these crazy hours, I would go home and I would spend 4 hours wandering around my hillside with a headlamp, like picking around with my plants, and it was my time to be in my garden. I got really into companion planting, and I'm a chef that finds my hands in the soil just as important as my hands, on the stainless steel pass or with knives and spoons.
Was there a first dish?
I would say honestly the true inspiration, which I don't recommend anyone does, but when I was a sous chef and I worked at Kraft, and we had probably just like you would go in during plum season, there'd be like 15 types of plums, and in a rush I'd need to be able to identify all of those types of plums, and the availability of all these amazing products that I would get from the farmers market, and like this plum that I'd never seen, this pear I'd never had. And I would go and I would take a piece of fruit home with me in the car, and I would smoke a joint. And I started to notice that in my drive home, dredging, the 45 minutes it took to cross the 405 from Century City to get to the west side, I started to see like, okay, well, I have really flavorful pot now, and I have these really amazing touchstones, and I was starting to discover my own palate. And these were lines that just started to click for me. So these were thoughts that I definitely had been entertaining for a long time. And then when I was at Soho, and before I decided to take the leap, I saw people doing it. People like Jeff the 420 Chef and some of the other people that are in Los Angeles now that are my contemporaries. I wouldn't say like, they're heroes, but I literally saw them as somebody that was doing something, that was taking a chance, representing something that I am and was passionate about, which is cannabis. And there's been plenty of restaurants where I worked at where there was a culture of alcohol use, and there was a culture of lusciousness and excess, but I would always hold back on cannabis use and talking about that as my preferred inebriant or my preferred way to relax, because I feel there's a stigma attached to it. Even in a culture of restaurants, some of the places that you worked at, a gin in the middle of service is far more acceptable than a joint, and it's.
Well, I mean, we've all been to sushi bars where it's like, let me buy a beer for the chef.
Absolutely.
How many do they go through in the course of an evening?
Believe me, I know, I've seen
with those sharp knives.
I find that what is most interesting about it is that cannabis puts you in a place with food that alcohol just does not. And I've seen this firsthand from my guests and from the experience and how in tune they are. And I've been to plenty of wine tastings where by the third or fourth glass, let alone plate, I'm 6-7 sheets to the wind, and I am like fully not engaged in the food. I'm there for the experience and the feeling and all that. When I do these cannabis dishes, these cannabis tastings, and it is really experiential driven, the table goes dead silent when the food drops. They are there for that dish. They are there to experience that flavor, that taste, and participate in my mind and participate in what has been born of something that we're writing the playbook for this. We are literally creating a style of hospitality that does not exist, and for somebody that felt like they did it all in cooking, worked for great restaurants, got awards, got accolades, and did it really, really quickly, I was successful. And this is just another new opportunity, and it's something that's not boring me because every day is different in it.
Rachel, have you gotten to taste everything?
Well,
Are you
I'm usually too busy running around working with Holden and trying to keep things moving. But I have witnessed this firsthand with a lot of our guests when we do the pairings, as opposed to perhaps an infused dinner. You know, infused dinners are great, but you do lose the nuance between specific varieties, and you kind of just go for it and you're enjoying
A molecule is a molecule.
a molecule is a molecule is a molecule. But when you're doing a pairing dinner, you know, it really does take on that wine tasting and wine pairing concept. And the other really good thing about that is that because when you are smoking cannabis, it has a shorter duration and it has a quicker onset. You can really be a lot more in control of that situation and how much you want to consume and how you want to feel. So we've even done dinners where there have been pregnant guests who have not consumed, but they have gone through the first 2 steps in our 3-step tasting method so that they can understand the flavor and the nuance. And then when they taste the dish, they get the pairing. They don't have to smoke it to get that pairing because it's about flavor.
Do we mean a token and a taste and
We
a token
mean,
and taste?
we mean that you would be dropped a dish and alongside it would come a joint, and you would walk people through a tasting of that. What we typically do is serve our joints in a corked glass tube. So the first step in the tasting method is to pull the cork off and nose the tube, which gives you those bright terpenes. It's a really, really good way to get a sense for what that specific cannabis flower tastes like. The second step is to take it out and do a dry pull, meaning before you light it, you put the joint in your mouth and you just suck and you inhale, and the air that flows through that joint and into your mouth and gets onto your palate will give you, again, that terpene expression, but this time on the palate. And then the third step is to take that first light and then, of course, go and enjoy the meal. And you know, some people don't like to smoke while they eat, so sometimes maybe they'll just do, you know, 1 or 2 puffs, put it out, go and enjoy their meal, and then go back to it, or put it back in that glass tube and take it home for later.
And to decide what works with what is the process?
Well, this is something that Holden and I collaborate pretty closely on, actually. It's a lot of tasting, honestly, and it's a tough job, Meryl. It's a really tough
Someone's
job.
gotta do it.
Somebody's got to do it. So yeah, we do taste together pretty frequently, and when Holden writes his menus, if we're working with a brand